I'm Lara Matosian, host of the Adjacent Possible podcast. The Adjacent Possible is a kind of shadow future, hovering on the edges of the present state of things, a map of all the ways in which the present can reinvent itself. This podcast is all about probing what's possible, what's probable, and what's preferable in education. Join us as we explore how we can overhaul our current pedagogical systems, solve global grand challenges, and bring about civilization-level change. The Adjacent Possible podcast is held in partnership with Area 2071, which is part of the Dubai Future Foundation. The Adjacent Possible podcast is also supported by Awecademy, a global educational organization that offers future-focused and wisdom-based education to high school learners with the aim of preparing them for a world of automation, artificial intelligence, and accelerating change. Our guests today are Rohan Roberts and Raya Bidshahri. Welcome to the Adjacent Possible podcast. You join me, your host, Lara Matosian, and our guests, founders of Awecademy and Intelligent Optimism, Raya Bidshahri and Rohan Roberts. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Tell us about the Intelligent Optimism movement. What inspired you to launch it?
So Intelligent Optimism is all about being excited and optimistic about the future, but in a rational way based on science, data, and evidence. The idea is to get everyone excited about the future, but also to recognize all the accomplishments that we've had in the past and everything that has contributed to human progress till this point. We do this through various mediums such as workshops, debates, newsletters, and an active social media reach with over 500,000 followers. Intelligent Optimism is also a core area in the Awecademy program of offerings. And we launched this because we realized that if you let your perception of humanity be guided by traditional news agencies or Hollywood movies, it's very easy to lose sight of the narrative of human progress. It's very easy to think that the world is getting worse. If you turn on the news today, you're going to be overwhelmed with headlines about struggling democracies, data privacy hacks, suicide epidemics, and much more. And it seems like every year it's getting worse and worse. So we wanted to raise awareness of actually, no, the world is getting better and can continue to get better as we move forward.
Yeah, and just to add to what Raya just mentioned, we're not saying the world is perfect. There is a lot of things that need to be fixed. There's much progress that we need to make. But what we are saying is when you compare the world today to how it was in previous centuries, we have made tremendous progress, and we will continue to make tremendous progress if you look at the trajectory of how things have been progressing over the last several decades and centuries.
So, what are some reasons to be intelligently optimistic? How do we counter the naysayers who disagree with the two of you?
Well, in the last 100 years, we've made tremendous progress. We've seen a 90% decrease in the maternal mortality rate, a 99% decrease in infant mortality, and a 100% increase in the average human lifespan. We've massively increased access to goods and services, communication, means of transportation, information, healthcare, and so on. I mean, just look at healthcare alone. We now have vaccines to protect us from a host of diseases, including measles, mumps, rubella, rabies, typhoid, diphtheria, dysentery, and so on. Most people, when they hear about this idea of intelligent optimism, they say, yeah, but what about wars? There's so many wars. Well, war is a technical word defined by the United Nations as any conflict with over 1,000 deaths on average per year. So by that definition, in the 1990s, we had around 13 wars. Today, that number is down to 7, including what's happening in Iraq and Ukraine and the Congo and so on. That's the fewest number of wars ever in the history of our species. We're now living in what's being described as the long peace. This is the longest period in human history that the world powers have gone without going to war. Even if you look at the average number of deaths per war, it's at its lowest, lower than it has ever been. Certain types of war have disappeared. For example, colonial wars have disappeared. The number of civil wars is at its lowest, and even interstate wars is at its lowest. Murder is another thing people raise, And that's because our newspapers are filled with stories about murders. But let's look at the data. In previous centuries, we had on average 100 murders per 100,000 people. Today, in many countries, that rate is down to 1 murder per 100,000 people. That's a 100-fold decrease in the murder rate. And we've also made massive strides in the rights revolution. Rights for women, rights for children, rights for animals, civil rights. We treat our criminals better. You know, the number of countries that have abolished the death penalty is now well over 100. And so we're making massive progress in the rights revolution as well. So these are just some of the reasons why we ought to be excited about the progress we're making. That's not to say the world is perfect. Absolutely not what we're saying. But things are getting better.
Yeah. In addition to all of that, world literacy is at its highest, the highest it's ever been. So anyone with a smartphone and internet access today can access courses and information from around the world, courses from elite universities like Harvard, like Yale. And we're also seeing that the number of people living in extreme poverty has been halved. There are more philanthropists today that have pledged to charity more than ever before in history. Above all, we're seeing the rise of exponential technologies like genetics, nanotechnology, robotics, artificial intelligence, which aren't just providing us fancy tools, but they're providing us with more powerful tools to solve global challenges that we are faced with.
Even when some people hear this, they still find it hard to believe that the world is getting better. They're kind of zeroed in on their own struggles or the struggles in their region or their particular background. And I think media has a role to play with that mindset. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so our brains are wired to pay more attention to the threats that we are faced with in our personal lives and the world at large. So there's been studies that have shown that we have more regions in our brain dedicated to negative stimuli than positive stimuli. And this biological hardware, we often forget, had evolved for the African savanna, where we constantly needed to be aware of the dangers that face us as individuals if we were going to survive. And news agencies know this, and that is exactly why they go with the philosophy of if it bleeds, it leads. In fact, data shows that for every positive news headline, we see up to 17 negative news headlines. So the reason it feels like the world is getting worse is because we are reporting more negative news than we are reporting positive news. We know that people are more likely to click and share and read articles related to terrorism and war than they are to do with articles about science and technology. So, on one hand, we can blame it on the news and the media agencies that are constantly pushing out this content. But what we have to remember is that we as consumers are also training journalists and agencies to focus on issues that they feel like will give them the most outreach and most profitability as well. I do want to clarify that we're not saying that we shouldn't ever cover negative news headlines. Of course, there are so many important issues in our world that need to be highlighted and need to be discussed in nuanced ways. What we're saying is we're disproportionately covering more negative news than we are positive news. So just as we highlight all the negative news in our world, we should also highlight all the incredible positive accomplishments that happen every single day.
And another reason why people tend to have this worldview that the world is getting worse is because we're susceptible to all kinds of cognitive biases, and one of them is the negativity bias. We tend to be more focused on bad news or pessimistic news and tend to remember bad news better, and so that's something to be aware of. Often when we do workshops, one of the activities we do with students is to give them a range of newspapers and then give them a bright red marker and tell them to scan the newspaper and use the red marker to scratch out or highlight all the negative news. And so they do that, and then we ask them to make an estimate of what percentage of the newspaper is filled with negative news or bad news. And very often, well over 70% to up to 95% on some occasions of the newspaper is filled with bad news. Rapes, murders, explosions, bomb blasts, terrorist attacks, hijackings, and so on. And that's just not an accurate reflection of the world we live in. Yes, there are terrible things happening in the world, but there are amazing, incredible things happening as well. There are people working really hard on solving many of the grand challenges facing humanity, and we need to give them that kind of exposure as well in our media.
If our listeners are interested in becoming intelligent optimists, do you have any books you recommend?
Yeah, well, one of the books that had a tremendous impact initially when we launched the movement was P.T.D. Amandus's book Abundance. The Future is Better Than You Think. And in the book, he talks about how technology is a resource liberating mechanism. And it was one of the most exhilarating books I've read. I love to read. I read about history and philosophy, science and literature, and so on. But when I read this book back in 2011, 2012, I was so taken by it. I went out and bought 15 copies of it and gave it to all my friends. And I said to them, you have got to read this book. Yes, this is a tremendous book, an eye-opening book. And as I mentioned, he talks about how technology is a resource-liberating mechanism. And he starts the book with the story of aluminium. And he talks about how aluminium used to be the most expensive metal on the planet, more expensive than gold, more expensive than silver. And a lot of people tend to think that that's because aluminium was rare. But aluminium's not rare. It is the second most abundant element in the Earth's crust. It was expensive because we didn't have the technology to extract it from its ore. Then along came the process of electrolysis. Suddenly, we had the technology to extract aluminium from its ore, and aluminium went from being expensive and scarce to being abundant and cheap. So abundant and so cheap that we now crumple it up and throw it in the garbage bin in the form of aluminium foil. So that was just one story, and it really grabs the attention of the reader, and forces you to reevaluate the way we look at problems, and he encourages the reader to take an abundance mindset to solving problems. So taking an abundance mindset essentially is to say the solution to scarcity is not to cut the pie thinner, but to build more pies or to bake more pies. Another example he gives is of how technology is useful is to say, here's an orange tree. You can pluck all the oranges that you can reach with your arm, and then you've plucked all the oranges, and you say, well, there's no more oranges. But then if you invent the technology of a ladder, suddenly there's all these new oranges available for you to pluck. And so that's just one example, and you can apply that thinking to everything else that's scarce today. Food, water, energy, information, education, healthcare. And all these things that are scarce can be made abundant and accessible to everyone with the right kind of technology. So P.T.D. Amandus and his book Abundance was an amazing influence on how we think.
Yeah, another excellent book is Infinite Progress by Byron Reese. So in Infinite Progress, Reese explains how tools like the internet, human ingenuity, and technological innovation can help us tackle what he calls the 5 historic plagues of human existence. That's ignorance, disease, poverty, hunger, and war. And what I find impactful about his narrative is it shows us how technology doesn't necessarily have to lead to some dystopian scenario where the robots take over and wipe humans out of existence. Instead, technology can actually be used to make the world a better place for every person alive. The really tools that we see are not inherently good or bad. It all comes down to how we use them as human beings. In addition to that, another excellent book that has just come out is Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker. In Enlightenment Now, Steven Pinker it conveys all these amazing graphs and a whole wealth of data about how the world has been getting better. But above all, he shows that human progress, as depicted in the book, is no accident. It doesn't just happen on its own. All this progress is driven by the right kind of values that we all opt into without realizing it, and those are the Enlightenment values. Enlightenment values include, reason, science, humanism, liberty, and progress. And it's really powerful because one of the counter arguments we always hear is, okay, let's say the world has been getting better. That doesn't mean it will continue to get better. And I agree, blind belief in progress or blind optimism doesn't guarantee that the world will get better. But what will guarantee that the world will get better is actually having a deep understanding of what is human progress, what does it look like, and what are the driving forces behind it. It's by really understanding those forces that we can ensure that we continue to replicate them moving forward into the future.
Steven Pinker had written another book very relevant to intelligent optimism, The Better Angels of Our Nature. Tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, in fact, that could, in some ways, could be a prequel to Enlightenment Now, and this was, I think, released 5 or 6 years ago. And in it, again, he looks at the data from various sources, the United Nations, the FBI, and so on, and looks at various areas of the human condition, and looks at murder rate, looks at wars, and the rights movements, and makes the case that the world is actually getting better. In fact, Steven Pinker is an incredible thinker, and that was an unintentional rhyme. But he is probably one of the most revered public intellectuals out there, and he was in Dubai recently at the Global Education and Skills Forum, and that took place in Atlantis a couple of weeks ago. And he was one of the keynote speakers, and he presented some of these ideas in the form of graphs and in his keynote talk, and did a tremendous job explaining to the audience why the world is getting better, because a lot of this doesn't have to do with one person's opinion. This is not a matter of my opinion versus yours. This is based on hard evidence and data and statistics. And all the data seems to indicate that if you look at previous centuries and compare it with the present is really an incredible place to be alive. And we should be thankful, but not rest on our laurels. There's still a long way to go.
Yeah. In fact, I challenge anyone who still disagrees with us is go get a copy of The Better Angels of Our Nature and actually debunk every piece of evidence that is in that book. It is a huge book. It's over 1,000 pages. And I remember when I first read it, I was underlining every paragraph and, putting sticky notes everywhere because there was such a wealth of evidence to support this claim that the world is getting better. So if you still disagree with us, I challenge you to actually debunk every piece of fact and evidence in that book.
So you've mentioned Pinker, Rees, and Diamandis. Who are other notable intellectuals in the intelligent optimism movement?
Another book I would encourage listeners to get hold of is Michael Shermer's book. It's called The Moral Arc. Again, it's a compendium of amazing stories, and not just stories, but facts and statistics about how the world is getting better. And the title is from Martin Luther King's quote, which goes something like this: "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And so if you look around us, many of the troubles, tribulations, and travails that we see in society may seem unsurmountable. But given enough time, and if you look at the big picture, and if you take a long view, we're going to get the better of many of these challenges.
I sure hope so. Any other recommendations, other notable intelligent optimists we should look out for?
Yeah, I think a lot of people know who Bill Gates is, but what they don't realize is Bill and Melinda Gates are very strong advocates for intelligent optimism. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has been releasing reports and evidence for human progress and lots of other resources like videos and articles that encourage a more optimistic mindset when it comes to the future. And they too have gathered a lot of data from the charities that they've worked with, from the various foundations that they've worked with, that show things like increase in human literacy, increase in human health and lifespan, and decrease in infant mortality. So they're also great names to look at.
Yeah, another figure would be Hans Rosling. In fact, if people haven't checked out his TED Talk, highly recommend it. Incredible TED Talk. Peter Diamandis' TED Talk is probably one of my all-time favorites. It's called Abundance. Just Google
just
Peter
look
Diamandis.
Up Peter Diamandis.
Abundance is our future.
There you go. Abundance is our future. And what does human progress look like to both of you?
Well, I align my vision or definition of human progress with Pinker's. In his latest TED Talk, which is also excellent, he points out that progress doesn't mean that everything becomes better for everyone, everywhere, all the time. Like that would be a miracle, and progress isn't a miracle, but rather progress is about problem solving. And above all, he points out that problems are inevitable. And also what we need to remember is that solutions to those problems also create problems. And they, in return, need to be solved. And that's just what human progress is. So, we have this intuitive vision of human progress that's about constant improvement all the time. But what Pinker points out is that we're constantly going to have challenges. But challenges are just that. They're not the end of the world. They're just another problem that we need to solve, just as we have in the past few centuries.
Yeah, and just to add to the Pinker's view of progress, people today live, people under the poverty line or just above the poverty line in many parts of America have better lifestyles than the robber barons from 150 years ago. People have access to better technologies than Rockefeller did, and he was one of the richest men in America. And so that's something to keep in mind, that we're not going to have a perfect society, but we're going to uplift large swathes of society. In fact, right now, we have to redefine poverty. If you compare the situation of the human condition a few centuries ago, 90% of the world lived in poverty, and just 10% were wealthy. Today, that entire number has flipped. Only 10% of the world lives in poverty, and 90% have moved out of or above the poverty line.
And so what are some mindsets that we can use to bring positive change across society?
Well, one of the ones I like to point to is called moonshot thinking. Now, before I explain what that is, it's important to realize the kind of context that we're talking about moonshot thinking in. So we're living through a time of accelerating change driven through exponential technologies. When we say that technology is growing exponentially, we mean that its power, computing power, is doubling every year. And to contrast that to linear growth, with linear growth, everything grows by the same amount, right? So if you were to take 30 linear steps forward, with each step being 1 meter in length, you would be 30 meters away. But if you were to take 30 exponential steps forward, where the length of your step doubled each time, so that's 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and so on, by step 30, you would be 1 billion meters away. That's 26 times around the planet. So that's how quickly our technology is advancing. It's the reason computers today are 100 million times more powerful than they were 50 years ago. It's also the reason that in the next 100 years, we won't see 100 years of human progress. We will see 20,000 years worth of human progress. So we have to ask ourselves, how can we possibly be prepared and keep up with such kind of radical change? And that's where moonshot thinking comes in. So moonshot thinking is a mindset that has been proposed by Google's innovation wing called Google X, the Moonshot Factory. It says that instead of a 10% improvement, we should see 10 times improvements in products and solutions. So it's not about incremental change, but rather radical and disruptive ideas moving forward. And according to them, moonshot lies at the intersection of huge challenge, radical solution, and breakthrough technology. But I like to challenge that definition a little bit, because I don't believe that moonshot thinking should just be about technology. We also need to see next improvements in societal values, morals, and government policies as well. It's only by taking that kind of a mindset can we keep up with the exponential growth and radical disruptions that we're seeing in society today.
Because along with the technological progress come a lot of questions, ethical ones, that we need to address that will impact our society and all the sectors that you mentioned.
Yeah, just to add to this whole moonshot thinking, the original moonshot was literally when we got to the moon. In the space of 10 years, we went from having no space program to having blueprints on the surface of the moon. We invented new alloys, new algorithms, new mathematics, new technologies, and we did it. We traveled 350,000 kilometers through space, landed human beings on the surface of the moon, and brought them back safely. Now, if we can do that in the space of 10 years, there is nothing that we can't achieve if we set our minds to it as a species, as a group of inspired individuals. So teaching students, teaching society, teaching individuals about the importance of moonshot thinking and the reality of being able to solve grand challenges, I think that's a crucial aspect of being an intelligent optimist.
Staying with mindsets, what does it mean to have an abundance mindset?
Well, we did speak about it earlier, where having an abundance mindset essentially is looking at technology as a resource-liberating mechanism that can make what was once scarce now abundant. So if you look at all the things that are scarce now, food, water, energy, education, healthcare, information, so on, with the right technology, we can make all of this abundant. I mean, food used to be scarce in the past and still is in many parts of the world, but we're making massive improvements. Anytime we make a visit to a supermarket, we see more variety of food during that one visit than our ancestors saw in their entire lifetime. So that's an example of abundance.
Yeah, and even in the context of entrepreneurship and the corporate world, for the longest time, businesses were designed and built around scarcity. So you find a solution or resource or product that was scarce, or you patent it in order to make it scarce, and then you capitalize on that scarcity. But we're seeing now that with the rise of social entrepreneurship, with the fact that technology is liberating, a lot of resources, that kind of scarcity model is no longer effective in the business or entrepreneurship world. What you need to have is an abundance mindset, which means having a business concept in where you can share your success and resources and products with others, and still be successful in the digital age.
Yeah, and sticking with entrepreneurship, what we're now seeing is an Uber for X, where X stands for anything that is scarce or anything that you have to wait for. So it's about harnessing the power of the crowd to make what was scarce now abundant. So you see an Uber for all kinds of things, not just transportation.
Mindset is fundamental to bring about change. Why is it important to inspire young minds to be intelligently optimistic?
Yeah, well, if you think about the mindset of a child, and think of what it must feel like to wake up every single morning and read the newspaper and see that it's filled with bad news, and to be told by everyone around you that the world is going to hell, that the things are getting worse, that there is no point planning for the future. This sort of pessimism fills the child with a sense of doom and gloom, with a sense of dread. But if, on the other hand, you fill them with a sense of optimism and show them all the amazing ways in which we're making progress, and share with them all the incredible people on the planet who are working so hard to overcome tremendous challenges, that fills them with a sense of optimism, a sense of excitement, a sense of can-do, will-do attitude. And they grow up to be doers and entrepreneurs who will go out there and solve the big challenges facing our problem, instead of burying their heads in their hands and thinking, oh, this is the end of the world.
Yeah, and we see this as being in the education space. We see the impact of this kind of dystopian thinking firsthand. For instance, we often do a lot of exercises about adaptive foresight and futures thinking with youth. And what we find repeatedly is it's much easier for these young minds to imagine a horrible doomsday scenario than it is for them to imagine a very exciting scenario. It's just intuitively easier for them. And that's because of, we talked about how the media has been leading into this, but I also believe that Hollywood, or science fiction movies in Hollywood, has been leading this. It's constantly been portraying dystopian visions or Terminator scenario visions for the future. When was the last time you watched a movie that painted a future of prosperity, of abundance, and transcendence? I can't think of a single movie other than Tomorrowland. But this has wired a lot of young minds to think about the future in a negative way. And in the words of His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, the ruler of Dubai, the future belongs to those who can imagine it, design it, and then create it. But if our young minds can't even imagine an exciting future, how can we possibly expect them to execute on that vision?
Yeah, and that's why one of the themes of the science fiction writing competition that was part of SciFest was Intelligent Optimism, where the young writers were encouraged to think of an exciting future and write about it. And that was based on a quote by the Imaginary Foundation, based out of San Francisco, that says, think of an exciting, ecstatic, desirable future and pull the present forward to meet it. And really, that's what we're doing through Awecademy, through SciFest Dubai, and through all the other initiatives that we're working on.
Well, we've touched upon all the different ways that having an intelligent, optimistic mindset is actually freeing. Can you tell us more why it is crucial to human progress? Crucial.
Yeah, physicist and futurist David Deutsch points out that problems exist and problems are solvable with the right kind of knowledge, right? And I believe that's also with the right kind of mindset to begin with. So if we're going to talk about constantly pushing humanity forward, constantly solving grand challenges, and contributing to what we call positive civilization level change, you can only do that if you have the mindset that problems are solvable. And that is exactly why intelligent optimism is crucial for human progress.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree with that.
And how can we bring intelligent optimism into schools and traditional curricula?
Well, intelligent optimism is one of the core areas of Awecademy. So students who want to access modules on it can do so on their own online. There's several modules on it. There's lots of videos out there, not just on TED, but on YouTube as well. And we also do workshops and boot camps revolving around the theme of Awecademy. We've done teacher training modules on it, and the theme of the initial SciFest Dubai in 2014 was intelligent optimism, and everything revolved around this optimistic view of the future. But I just want to highlight, we're having this conversation about intelligent optimism, and really the emphasis is on the intelligent element as well. This is not blind optimism. This is not taking a rose-tinted view of the future. This is not being a Pollyanna about the state of the world. This is really about facing facts and looking at the data, and also acknowledging that the world is not perfect. There's much progress that we need to do, but it's also about highlighting the amazing things that people are doing.
Yeah, I think one easy way to do it is to actually bring into your curriculum all the things that we've touched on today. So in addition to all the resources Rohan pointed out, there's a whole series of videos, articles, books, recommended thinkers on the Intelligent Optimism website. So that's intelligentoptimism.com. And as you know, make it a thing to ensure that every student that graduates from your class or from your school understands what human progress is, what the driving forces behind progress are, what are enlightenment values, and why are they important, what are the mindsets that you need in order to have a positive impact on humanity, and how can you start having those mindsets. So these need to be incorporated into the core curriculum. And that's exactly what we do with Awecademy. We have a lot of modules and programs online and offline on such themes, but you can always also design your own if there's that kind of will and drive to do so.
And I'd like to emphasize that it's important, and we owe this to ourselves, and students owe this to themselves as well, to seek out new sources of information and move beyond mainstream media. And not allow themselves to be influenced only by what the CNNs of the world tell us.
I feel that in the context of schools and traditional curricula, there needs to be buy-in from the administrators in charge, and then following that, thorough professional development for the educators, the teachers, because they will be facilitating this kind of learning. What suggestions do you have with regards to that?
Well, one of the best ways we can advocate for such change is to, be a champion for it. As thought leaders ourselves, we often, or as as people who provide alternative means of education, we often look for those champions in those schools. So if there's a particular teacher or school leader that is particularly excited, they can serve as a champion and go to the principals and go to the policymakers and push for it as much as possible. But I also think it's important to focus on the why of any new idea or solution in the education space. So we do this all the time when we go into schools to speak to them about our programs and Awecademy. We don't just say to them, hey, here's what we do. We say to them, this is what where the world is headed. This is what has happened in the last 100 years and will continue to happen in the future of humanity. And this is why we need to have this kind of an education for young minds. So it's a very effective strategy. There's been decades of studies to show that companies and entrepreneurs and innovators that pitch by focusing on the why of their offering are far more successful than those that focus on the how or the what.
I mean, we started the Intelligent Optimism movement in Dubai in 2011 initially with high school students. And then these students grew up, they graduated, they went to different parts of the world, and they took that message with them to Singapore and Canada and England and everywhere. And so now you have Intelligent Optimism Global, where we have sort of ambassadors and leaders who are leading these things, these ideas in their city. So if someone's out there who would like to be an ambassador for Intelligent Optimism, just get on the website, get in touch with the organization, and we'll make it happen.
I think that there is a very strong strain of intelligent optimism in Awecademy and its inspiration and its creation. Tell us about the story of Awecademy.
Yeah, so I've been a young entrepreneur. I was lucky to be part of the founding team of SciFest Dubai, which was launched in order to celebrate sciences through the arts and engage the general public, with science and technology. And I was part of the founding team of that alongside you guys. So that was amazing. And I went on to the United States to study neuroscience and did research projects there, worked on more startups, such as SheWorks, which became a contingent workforce platform for women, and various initiatives. And for me, the more time I spent in the workforce and the more time I spent doing kind of social impact projects that had a positive impact on the world, and the more time I spent in formal education, the more I saw a mismatch between what young people like me needed to know in order to have a positive impact on humanity versus what traditional education tends to focus on. And so if you focus traditional education from around the world, there's an emphasis on grades, content knowledge, isolated subjects, and it has predominantly been designed in the industrial era in order to create factory-style workers that did routine and monotonous tasks. And that kind of a model is simply not fit for purpose in today's world and in the information age. So it was those set of problems that angered me, and it was really around that time that when I started speaking to Rohan about addressing these set of problems. So maybe, Rohan, you want to share your perspective as an educator in the space?
I mean, so one of the things I like about Awecademy and the reason I collaborate so closely with Raya on this is because we share this optimistic view about the future, and we want to share that worldview with the youth population, with the student population, not just in Dubai but around the world. So what we want to do is share this big picture view, zoom out, see the big picture, take a cosmic perspective, help bring about positive civilization level change, and that's what makes Awecademy unique. It's the vision and mission of the organization that we want to share with everyone else, and that's what's inherently optimistic about the platform.
Yeah, and I think at the core, we saw a problem and we thought we needed to solve it. And that's exactly what I encourage other people to do. Because for me, it was a very debilitating problem. As someone who loved learning but ended up in a position where I hated formal education, I hated going to those lecture halls, and I felt like university just sucked that love of learning out of me. It was a very painful process. Like, my mental health was at an all-time low. I found that I didn't have time to focus on the things I was actually passionate about, which included learning, reading and watching documentaries and stuff. And that was a very debilitating thing. So instead of, feeling like, okay, this is just the way that it is, and we should let it be the way it is, we thought, okay, let's do something about it. And I think that's ultimately what leads to human progress, is a whole bunch of people saying, let's do something about it.
So through your pain, you found your why, your massive transformative purpose. So to end this conversation, I would like you each to expand a little on what you are each optimistic about, intelligently optimistic about.
Well, I'm very optimistic about the rise of these exponential technologies. I think we've taken for granted the tools that we have access to. The computer that's in front of me is 100 million times more powerful than it was 15 years ago. And it's also an extension of my mind. I use it to store my memories. I use it to communicate with other people, and it's an extension of my neocortex. And as a result, it's redefined who I am as a human being in a positive way. So I do believe that, tools like genetic engineering will allow us to tackle a whole range of diseases. Tools like artificial intelligence will allow us to solve problems at a higher level of intelligence, beyond anything we can imagine. And tools like 3D printing will allow us to bring down the cost of manufacturing and make things like housing much more affordable. So I'm personally very excited and optimistic about exponential technologies and the way we can use them to contribute to human progress.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I'm excited about the impact exponential technologies will have on education. We now have 3 billion new minds coming online from the most underprivileged and impoverished parts of the world and contributing to the world discourse. And they can do that using their mobile phone, using access to the internet. And now they have access to educational platforms around the world, massive open online courses, MOOCs, that allow individuals who are interested in learning to be able to learn in ways they could never before. And so the prospects of making tremendous progress in the field of education fills me with excitement and optimism.
Well, that was a very refreshing conversation with a worldview that I encourage everyone to consider taking. Raya and Rohan, thank you very much for coming on our podcast.
Well, thank you for having us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.